watching All 24 News World News Program. Next up are the headlines. Iran links the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz to an end to the blockade. Trump says no talks with Tehran are planned as Qatar urges a return to negotiations. Also in our news tonight, regional tensions escalate with Yemen intensifying attacks on the Houthis, while Zionist occupation strikes hit Palestine and Lebanon alongside an incursion into Syria. Next up, the UN condemns Morocco's abuses against Sahrawi detainees and calls for compensation. The Telegraph reports restrictions on journalists entering the occupied territories. The UN envoy to Libya rejects parallel tracks to the roadmap, calling the next phase decisive while urging accountability for drone attacks on vital infrastructure. First off in our news tonight, the Strait of Hormuz is once again emerging as a key flashpoint between Washington and Tehran as the two sides remain divided over its status and the conditions for return to negotiations. Karim Asfar reports.
The Strait of Hormuz is once again at the center of the standoff between Washington and Iran. While US President Donald Trump says there are currently no talks with Iran and insists the strategic waterway is operating normally, Tehran disputes that account. Iranian officials say the Strait of Hormuz will remain closed until Washington meets its key conditions under the interim deal reached in June 2026.
Let me be clear. Until the United States fulfills its commitments under the agreement, including lifting the blockade, releasing frozen assets, lifting oil sanctions, ending threats and military operations on all fronts, and implementing the other conditions to which it committed, the Strait of Hormuz will not reopen.
Meanwhile, Qatar is now watching closely for a possible breakthrough, with its attention now focused on the outcome of Iran-Oman negotiations over the Strait of Hormuz. According to Doha, an agreement on this strategic waterway could significantly ease the way for broader talks between Tehran and Washington.
Our current focus is on this issue, the return to what was mentioned in the Memorandum of Understanding and resuming negotiations between both parties. These efforts are ongoing, of course, but as you know, we're also awaiting an agreement between the sisterly Sultanate of Oman and Iran regarding the Strait of Hormuz, which will, as we said, enable us to return to the framework of negotiations.
It is worth noting that the 60-day deadline set by Washington and Tehran under their June 17 memorandum has now expired, and with both sides still divided over the terms for renewed negotiations, diplomatic efforts are intensifying to bring Washington and Tehran back to the negotiating table.
Meanwhile, Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi says Tehran rejected a ceasefire during the recent war to strengthen its position in negotiations with the United States. Speaking at a press conference Tuesday, Araghchi says Iran's adversaries sought to force its unconditional surrender in the early days of the conflict. He stressed that goal was not achieved, saying Iran fought with strength and negotiated with strength. In the same context, the UK Maritime Trade Operations Agency says a vessel was hit by an unidentified projectile while transiting the Strait of Hormuz on Tuesday. The incident damaged the ship's engine room and injured one crew member. Oman's Coast Guard is assisting the remaining crew, according to the agency. Elsewhere in the Middle East, in Iraq, Iraqi Prime Minister Ali Falah al-Zaidi has ordered oil companies to operate around the clock to maintain production and exports amid disruptions linked to the Strait of Hormuz closure. He called for stronger export capacity in alternative transport routes, while urging officials to use the crisis to upgrade infrastructure and ensure steady crude oil flows. Meanwhile, two major Chinese shipping companies have suspended oil tanker operations through the Strait of Hormuz and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, Reuters reports. Sources say COSCO and China merchants halted voyages amid rising attacks and military tensions in the region, prompting China to seek alternative shipping routes. At the same time, ship traffic through the Strait of Hormuz has risen slightly, with 6 cargo vessels crossing on Monday, according to Kepler data. Meanwhile, supertanker earnings on the Middle East-Asia route have surged to a 2-month high of $510,000 a day. Bloomberg says tighter vessel availability and heightened security risks are driving freight rates sharply higher. Elsewhere, Yemen's Defense Council has ordered expanded air and missile operations against the Houthis following recent attacks. The UN expressed deep concern, warning that the escalation could drag Yemen further into wider regional conflict and threaten trade and energy flows. In Syria, occupation forces carried out 8 airstrikes on Abu Duhur military airport in Syria's Idlib province, damaging the facility but causing no casualties. Damascus condemned the strikes as a violation of its sovereignty. Separately, occupation forces advanced toward Bet el-Warda hill near Beit Jin in western Damascus countryside, in another reported incursion into southern Syria. Meanwhile, in Lebanon, the UN has warned of a worrying escalation in southern Lebanon, with UNIFIL reporting intensified military activity and restrictions on its movement. The UN also says recent Israeli occupation airstrikes have thus displaced hundreds of families, deepening the ongoing displacement crisis and uncertainty among those trying to return home.
UNIFIL peacekeepers recorded intense kinetic activities across its area of operations over the weekend, including 5 IDF airstrikes near Al-Mansari in Sector West. In Sector East, IDF airstrikes were reported west of Al-Kantara, Tolusa, and 2 helicopter attacks were reported northwest of Deir Syrian. UNIFIL also reported extensive IDF indirect fire activity across its area of operations, also north of the Litani rivers, particularly on Saturday, when they recorded a total of 337 rounds. Meanwhile, UNIFIL peacekeepers discovered and neutralized several unexploded ordnance. Peacekeepers also continued to encounter restrictions on their freedom of movement and incidents of aggressive behavior.
Moving on to Gaza now, 7 people, including a child, were killed and others injured in an occupation strike on a cafe at the Fishermen's Port west of Gaza City. Palestinian reports say the wounded were taken to Al-Shifa hospital. In the West Bank, occupation forces have continued their siege of Qasra, south of Nablus, for a 10th consecutive day. Local authorities say 3 homes remain surrounded and isolated from their families, as the area is declared a closed military zone, while settlers continue moving freely around the town. Also, Israeli occupation forces arrested at least 7 Palestinians in raids across the occupied West Bank and Al-Quds on Tuesday. 3 people, including a child, were detained south of Bethlehem, while another child was arrested in Al-Quds. A doctor was also detained after Israeli occupation forces raided her home in Ramallah. And now a major investigation by the Financial Times is shedding light on the UAE's growing role in conflicts across Africa, with allegations of mercenary recruitment, arms supplies, and the exploitation of the continent's resources. Here's Arfajani with more.
The UAE's criminal activities have come under the microscope of the Financial Times, and the findings are far from flattering. The British newspaper's investigation highlights the UAE's active role in destabilizing a number of countries, particularly by continuously fueling conflicts across Africa through the financing of terrorist groups, notably in Sudan, Somalia, and Libya. According to the Financial Times, a regional network specialized in recruiting, transporting and training mercenaries is being run by the UAE. The network stretches from Colombia to the Emirates, then to Bosaso in Somalia, Al-Kurfa in Libya and Yalan al-Fashar in Sudan. The British newspaper based its investigation on testimonies from former fighters who took part in conflicts where this network operates. It also examined travel records, digital data, photographs and other documents linked to the network. The investigation notes that under the leadership of Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan, the UAE has rapidly expanded its investments, influence and military presence across several parts of Africa, seeking to capitalize on the continent's trade and resources as it prepares for a post-oil future. According to the investigation, in the Horn of Africa and particularly in East of Africa, the UAE has established partnerships with non-state armed groups, supplying them with weapons in exchange for illegally mined gold. The Financial Times also reports that huge quantities of gold have been taken from Sudan for the benefits of the UAE, describing it as one of the biggest gold thefts in history. The investigation further reveals that the UAE recruited thousands of Colombian mercenaries to fight alongside the Rapid Support Forces in Sudan through UAE-based private security company Global Security Services Group. The British newspaper says the first group of Colombians arrived in October 2024, tasked with establishing a logistic corridor to transport supplies through eastern Libya and into Darfur. The Financial Times investigation confirms what Algeria has been denouncing for years: the UAE's damaging actions on the international stage, particularly across Africa, driven exclusively by efforts to control the continent's natural resources and weaken sovereign states that stand in its way.
Turning to Africa, the UN Committee Against Torture has renewed its condemnation of Morocco over the treatment of Sahrawi activist Abdelmoula al-Hafidi in prison. A recent report describes his detention conditions as degrading, citing poor ventilation and lighting, and inadequate access to drinking water and sanitation. Al-Hafidi has been serving a 10-year sentence since his arrest in 2016.
The committee concluded that Morocco had failed to meet its obligations under Article 13 of the Convention, as the authorities failed to ensure a prompt, impartial and effective investigation into complaints concerning conditions of detention, safeguarding the right to lodge complaints and seek redress. Morocco violated the Convention Against Torture in the case of Sahrawi human rights defender Abdelmoula al-Hafidi over the conditions of his detention in 8 Milloul prison. The conditions of detention amounted to degrading treatment.
The UN Committee Against Torture has also called on Morocco to provide full redress to Sahrawi activist Abdelmoula al-Hafidi, including compensation and rehabilitation.
The UN Committee Against Torture is calling on Morocco to provide Abdelmoula al-Hafidi with full redress, including compensation for material and non-material damages, rehabilitation, and guarantees that the violations will not be repeated. The committee also urges Morocco to refrain from any pressure, intimidation, or retaliation against al-Hafidi, and to take steps to prevent further violations, including setting up an independent and impartial mechanism to investigate allegations of mistreatment and detention conditions. Moroccan authorities have 90 days from the date the decision was adopted to report on the measures taken to implement the committee's recommendations.
In another development, the British newspaper The Telegraph reports strict Moroccan restrictions on foreign journalists seeking to enter the occupied Sahrawi territories. Its reporters said they faced surveillance, while the paper cited previous cases of European journalists being detained and expelled from the region. In a related story, the Polisario Front's legal campaign to protect Sahrawi rights over natural resources took center stage at its summer university in Boumerdaz province in Algeria. Sahrawi presidential advisor Abi Bashrai al-Bashir said European courts have ruled that economic agreements covering the territory's resources are lawful, without the explicit consent of the Sahrawi people through their recognized representative. Also in Morocco, Moroccan anti-normalization activist Ahmed Wahman says the mass movement towards Spanish-controlled Ceuta is a direct result of government policies. He says that dozens of families were forcibly displaced after their land was seized and transferred to Zionist investors under the guise of investment. Turning to Tunisia, Tunisian President Kais Saied has pledged to continued education reforms aimed at building a system free from political interference. Saied said previous reforms were influenced by foreign dictates, stressing Tunisia's rejection of external interference in its education and academic affairs. Meanwhile, in the region, Algeria and Niger have reaffirmed their commitment to strengthening bilateral cooperation and advancing major joint projects. Talks in Yemen focused on the successful Kafra oil field project and the Trans-Saharan gas pipeline linking Nigeria and Algeria through Niger, with both sides highlighting its development and environmental benefits. Turning to Libya, UN envoy to Libya, Hannah Tata, has warned against parallel tracks to the UN-led political process. Addressing the UN Security Council, Tata said alternative initiatives could waste time and urged all Libyan political parties to engage within the UN roadmap.
We will continue to work with all parties, holding discussions and consultations in an effort to address any concerns and misgivings, and working to build trust to advance the roadmap. Establishing parallel tracks and initiatives can create opportunities for wasting time and forum shopping. We believe that this should be discouraged.
UN envoy Hannah Tata also says Libya's next phase will be decisive, requiring political will and compromises to unify state institutions through inclusive elections. She expects the UN roadmap to take longer, but says this reflects adaptation to political realities, not a loss of direction.
Institutions capable of leading the country towards elections. We count on the continued constructive. We now enter a critical phase, advancing unified institutions and the conditions necessary for inclusive election. This requires political resolve and compromise from Libyan stakeholders, with priority given to the national interest and the interest of Libyan people across the country. Sustained and coordinated international support is also essential. The roadmap may require more time than initially envisaged. This is not a loss of direction, but a necessary adaptation to political realities and the views of Libyan stakeholders and international partners.
UN envoy Hannah Tata has further voiced concern over attacks targeting energy facilities in Libya, calling for urgent investigations and accountability. She warned that such attacks damage civilian infrastructure and disrupt essential services for Libyans. Let's take a listen again.
The use of several drones against the oil refinery and other vital infrastructure in Zawiya is an emerging and worrying development, suggesting deliberate targeting of the oil facility, causing structural damage, risk of fire, and disruption of water supplies. On the 10th of August, the National Oil Corporation declared a state of emergency at the refinery and called for urgent investigations into these attacks. The strikes on civilian infrastructure require thorough investigation, and the perpetrators must be held accountable. This has broader implications, not only for Zawiya and Surman, but for the delivery of public goods and services to the wider population of the western region of the country.
Elsewhere in Africa, more than 5,000 displaced people have arrived in Damascene, Sudan's Blue Nile capital, following recent attacks in the region. Sudan Doctors Network says they face severe shortages of food, medicine, and shelter, raising fears of disease outbreaks amid limited resources. In health news, the World Health Organization says the Ebola outbreak in the Democratic Republic of Congo could be brought under control within 3 months. W Emergency Chief Turner Bolde says this remains possible if the necessary resources are made available. Turning to Europe, French electricity prices have surged to their highest level since January 2025. Tuesday delivery contracts reached €177 and 34% per megawatt hour, driven by pressure on the power grid and lower nuclear output due to operational restrictions at several reactors. Across the Atlantic, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney says his plans to speak with the United States President Donald Trump before Wednesday's deadline for new 50% tariffs on Canadian imports. Carney says the talks will focus on what he calls historic investment, with opportunities to advance negotiations in the next 48 hours. Finally, in sports, the Algerian women's national football team returned home Monday after a historic Africa Cup of Nations campaign in Morocco. The team finished third, secured Algeria's first ever Women's World Cup qualification, and also received the tournament's Fair Play Award. Well, that's all for tonight. Thank you for watching. See you next time.